a second, I'll be turning things over to our moderator, Jean-Claude Brizard. He is the president and CEO of Digital Promise, and he'll be leading our panel today. And our panelists will include Evan Marwell, who's the CEO of EducationSuperHighway, Jessica Rosenworcel, chairwoman of the FCC, Jim Steyer, founder and CEO of Common Sense Media, and John King, president and CEO of the Education Trust. So we're really excited to have them all here and get things started this morning. So here to talk about the digital divide brought on by the pandemic, please give it up for our panel.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. We have a great panel for you this morning. Again, not going to take the time to read bios to you. It's all in the paperwork. You also just heard who they are. It's an all-star studded panel. So New America and Common Sense Media published reports in the last few months focused on the digital divide. The bottom line is we've made progress because of conditions, of course, during the pandemic, but we've got a lot more work to do. Among families with 6 to 13-year-olds, 91% now have a computer at home. The increase has been especially pronounced amongst families living below the poverty line, from 69% in 2015 to 86%, sorry, to 2021. But looking at computer and smartphone ownership, both at home and personal devices, between lower, middle, and higher income students, we have a substantial gap that was outlined by Common Sense Media. We also have an underconnected issue. Of those who have broadband, 55% say the service is too slow, and 18% say that the broadband, the access has been turned off at least once in the last year. So when you think about the fact that our lives nearly depend on connectivity, access to powerful devices, so what do we need to do once and for all to close this issue, to close this divide? And John, I'll start with you.
Yeah. Well, look, we certainly have made progress over the last 2 years on closing the digital divide. We should celebrate that, but there is a lot of risk of sliding backwards. The federal investment has helped to close that gap. There's an open question whether or not that federal investment will continue. There's a challenge at the federal and state level of making sure that people have the quality of connectivity, the reliable speed that you're referring to. But then there's all the implementation challenges. Teachers still haven't gotten all the professional development they need around how to leverage the technology to support their kids. Parents still don't have access to reliable technical support from their school districts. So those kinds of challenges, when things aren't working, who do you go to? We haven't solved those. And we still haven't produced the tools that we need to make the technology helpful in closing all of our equity gaps. And so we see that kids are struggling academically, particularly low-income kids and kids of color, who missed a lot of classroom instruction. And we see kids struggling socio-emotionally because of the isolation from school and peers and teachers. So we have a lot of work to do from an equity perspective.
Well, as the chairwoman of the Federal Communications Commission, I think this is really the infrastructure challenge of our day. We've got to figure out how to connect everyone, everywhere. 100% of us. This is akin to the challenge we had with electricity a century ago. And we're coming out of this pandemic, and it's great to be here. I don't take for granted being in person at events anymore. We're going to have to seize this moment and decide that we connect people no matter who they are or where they live. And it strikes me that starting with students is starting with the future. We've got to make sure every one of them has the connection, the device, and the digital skills necessary to participate fully in the modern economy. And we've got to choose to make it a national priority. And I think recent legislation that we've been working on at the FCC has helped to make that happen, though I take John's point that we've got to be mindful of the potential for backsliding and make sure that when we get everyone connected, we keep them connected.
Thank you. We're going to come back to that in a second.
Well, I mean, I agree completely with what John and Jessica just said. I'd say three things to the audience. Number one, the money has been appropriated to close the digital divide. So it is on all of us now to close it, period, full stop. The money is there. We're really lucky that Chairwoman Rosenworcel is head of the FCC because she really knows this. We have worked together for 15 years on this stuff. She's the creator of the homework gap lingo, showing how much she cares about kids. So number one, this is the moment, and everyone here should care about this, whether you're a parent or not, whether you're an educator or not. That's number one. Second, it's going to end up now being done at the state and local level. So you should be involved, no matter how many pitches you're making here for your company or trying to think through how you want to build your new ed tech startup or grow your existing ed tech business. You also ought to remember that in your community, as John just said, there are literally millions, and Jean-Claude said, there are millions of kids around the country who do not have the basic connectivity at home that doesn't allow them to get the education, healthcare, their parents to get the job opportunities, et cetera. So we have the moment, and you can do it at the state and local level. And the third thing I would just say is this. This is an ed tech conference. I've spoken here several times. At the end of the day, you're here, I hope, because you care about kids. So kids in this country have been screwed over the last couple of years, particularly low-income kids, in terms of the resources that are available to them. John spoke about that a little. But the learning loss among low-income kids, the mental health issues that all kids, I am a father of 4, and I've seen it up close and personal, but they're not low-income kids. And this is a moment where all of us need to be child advocates. So we have one more day of this conference. You're creating some of the most important ed tech tools ever, but you're also child advocates, and I hope you will take that home from GSV for the months and years ahead when we close the digital divide.
So the issue I want to highlight is affordability. 25% of the households in America don't have an internet connection. Of that, 2/3 of them, over 18 million households, have access to the internet, but they can't afford it. So if we're going to really close the digital divide, not only do we have to build infrastructure everywhere, but we have to make sure that everyone can afford to get an internet connection. And the sad reality is that that means we have to make it free. There have been $10 plans available to most of these households for 10 years, but yet they still can't even afford $10 to get online. And so we need to make sure that we leverage the infrastructure bill, both the infrastructure parts of it as well as the Affordable Connectivity Program that Chairman Rosenworcel, I'm sure, will talk about, to actually get those people connected and get the unconnected people connected.
And Evan, what I've seen as well too is that the paperwork, even to get the $10 connection, is a barrier for many, many parents. Chairwoman, I want to come back to you. I mean, Jim talked about this idea of the homework gap. I mean, you coined that term, I think last year with a whole bunch of kids we had online talking to you. What does that mean? What is that, and what are you doing about it?
Yeah, so when I first got to the Federal Communications Commission, I did what a lot of people do when they come to an agency, a company, or an institution. You start studying every program you have and seeing what you can improve on. And there's a program that's been at the FCC since the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and it's called E-Rate. It's the nation's largest education technology program, and I'm still stunned that Congress had the foresight to create this in 1996 when I was calling the internet the information superhighway. Maybe you did too. But in 1996, Congress decided that the FCC should be responsible for making sure all of our nation's libraries and classrooms got high-speed internet. So year in and year out, we've been running this program to help connect our classrooms. And so I went around the country and visited with educators. And it didn't matter if it was in a rural school in Colorado or an urban school in Pennsylvania. They all told me the same thing. They had this great connection from E-Rate in their classroom, their schools. They could bring in new teaching tools, but they didn't have confidence when their kids went home that they'd have the internet. And so they couldn't do their nightly schoolwork. And you saw them sitting in the parking lot at the school after the final bell rung just to catch the free Wi-Fi signal. They're the same kids who were sliding into a booth at a fast food restaurant to do their homework with a side of fries. And I felt like this part of the digital divide needed focus. And so I started calling it the homework gap, because all of those teachers told me over and over again these were kids who couldn't do their homework because they didn't have the internet at home. And as everyone here knows, during the pandemic, that homework gap became an educational chasm. And we're still going to have to figure out how to get ourselves out of it. But the good news from this crisis is that Congress paid attention. And after years and years of me knocking on doors on Capitol Hill and saying, we have to fund efforts to close this homework gap, we have to build on what was done in the E-rate, we were able to secure more than $7 billion to help fund connections and devices for students around the country in a program called the Emergency Connectivity Fund. And I'm proud to say in the last year, the FCC has connected more than 12 million students for this purpose. But again, we're going to have to make sure that those connections stay where they are, and we keep those kids online, and we keep them connected, because we know that is essential for their success in school and in the modern economy.
So the Emergency Connectivity Fund is $7.2 billion. What's next for the program?
Well, right now we're running our third and final window for funding. We have $1 billion left in that fund that Congress provided us with. So there are applications that can come in from schools and libraries all across the country, and I will give a shout out for the dates. That starts on April 28th, and we close that window on May 13th. It is a last shot to secure these funds to help connect those kids. And after we're done with that, I think we're going to do a big assessment and try to understand who we got connected, who we missed, and how we can look at the E-rate program and update it so that no child is left offline.
Thank you. Secretary, John, as long as I've known you, we go back, I don't know, 20 years maybe, you've always been about equity of outcomes for kids, especially in low-income communities. And we know that the pandemic has hit those communities hardest when it comes to things like learning loss. So if you were elected the next governor of Maryland, how will you make that state the exemplar for the nation?
Yeah. I love that question. Look, first of all, we need to make sure that everyone in the state has reliable, high-speed internet access, and we're going to leverage the federal resources and state resources to do that. That's important for education. It's also important for economic development. It's important for access to telehealth. It really is today a civil rights issue to make sure that people have reliable internet access. But then from an education standpoint, there's some big things that need to change. We should never again say to a student, you can't take that class because it's not taught in this building. Right? At this point, we know that students should be able, if they want to take an AP class, if they want to learn a language, it doesn't have to be offered in their building by a teacher in that building. We've got to make sure that's available to kids all across our state. We've got to make sure that teachers and principals are prepared to leverage technology in the classroom. There are lots of places around the country where people are doing very cool things with technology to help kids learn, discover new worlds, new experiences. And there are also a lot of places where the use of ed tech looks like worksheets on a screen. And helping teachers and principals sort through the tools that are available and use them effectively, that's got to be a part of our approach to teacher prep and teacher professional development. And then we've got to make up for the disruptions of the last 2 years. You know, think about a kid who was a first grader in 2020. That's the year, my wife taught first grade. That's the year where you really learn to read. Now that kid missed half of first grade, then missed potentially all of second grade, right? And so we've got to intervene. What I've called for in Maryland is to mobilize a statewide tutoring corps and to recruit recent college graduates, retired teachers to work one-on-one, two-on-one, providing high-quality tutoring, but also mentoring and those positive relationships that will help kids reconnect to school. That's all a start, right? But ultimately, I think we've got to ask ourselves as a country, what are we willing to do to ensure a just future? Majority of kids in our nation's public schools are kids of color. Majority of kids in the nation's public schools access the free and reduced price lunch program. If we don't educate low-income students and students of color, we have no future as a country. So those are the stakes.
John, thank you. Jim, let me come to you. There's a lot that Common Sense Media is doing to address this issue, the issue of the digital divide, your role in the future of the Tech Commission, the role of schools in helping close this gap. Would you please outline for us what Common Sense Media is doing, the efforts and progress today?
So, sure, thanks. I would say, one, I will repeat again, being up here with these guys is great because these are the people who probably more than anybody I know worked to close the digital divide over the past few years. That is a really big thing. So at Common Sense, you all probably know us mostly for our consumer platform, but the truth is we're the biggest advocacy group in this space around issues like privacy and misinformation, disinformation. So one thing, and we worked with Chairman Rosenworcel on this a lot. So I was part of a Future of Tech Commission that worked closely with the White House to put a heavy, clear advocacy agenda around tech policy. So number one on the advocacy stuff, we're looking at a comprehensive tech policy strategy. It includes the closing the digital divide permanently. That's, to me, more of an execution challenge now than a legislative challenge. But it also deals with issues like privacy, platform accountability, misinformation, disinformation. That's one thing we're doing. The second thing is working with the people up here. We're going to work to really make sure that the broadband deployment actually occurs, because we do have this historic opportunity. It's like building the Interstate Highway Commission back in the 30s. It's eminently doable if we execute well and if we continue to have the political will. So we're going to do a lot of that. And then the third thing I think, and this really speaks to what John was just saying, is we feel that not only have students suffered extraordinarily over the past couple of years, but so have educators. And I think we're going to spend we have a big schools program, about over 1.3 million teacher members at Common Sense. We built the field of digital literacy and digital citizenship. And I think what we really want to do in the next few years is empower teachers to be happy in their jobs, stay in their jobs, and quite frankly, use the products and technology that you all are developing. Because the classroom is never going to be the same. We all know that. The last 2 years have fundamentally transformed education. So I think the third big thing we're going to do is really work with folks like you to make teachers more effective and bring up every kid in this country to the kind of educational experience they should have.
I'm so glad you mentioned teachers. One thing we've learned is that when we talk about the divide, it's not just about students and student access, it's educator access, it's educator support and development. All that becomes part of the work. In fact, we found too that parents benefit when you have that kind of one-to-one access to technology. Evan, let me bring you into the conversation. So EducationSuperHighway has worked to, 99% of schools have access to broadband, much thanks, frankly, to the kind of effort that you've been pushing last number of years, including supporting schools on how to spend all the money coming from the FCC every single year. Now that the federal government has made an investment of $85 billion into this effort as well, what do you see as the key things that need to happen to ensure that this historic investment actually connects the underconnected?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of parallels between the work that happened from 2012 to 2020 to connect all the schools in America to what we have to do now to connect all the homes in America. So I'd say the first thing is we've got to get the policy right? So Congress has sort of done its part. They've allocated the funding. Jessica's team has done yeoman's work rolling out new programs. We're now waiting on the Commerce Department to do some similar stuff. But I think much like the E-rate program that Jessica talked about a few minutes ago, they came out with the E-rate program, and then they went back to the E-rate program, and they said, okay, well, what have we learned in the time that it's been out? Now let's make some adjustments. And there are going to be some key adjustments that we need to make to the Affordable Connectivity Program, to the programs that are being rolled out at NTIA. And then we have a new challenge, which is we have to make sure that the states get the policy right? So it doesn't end at the federal government, because all the money pretty much is going to flow down to the states, and they're going to have to decide how to do things. So what Jim was talking about. So that's number one. We got to get the policy right. Number two, we need to make sure that we're targeting our efforts to the people who are truly unconnected, right? So, there's a lot of barriers that get in the way of somebody who isn't online getting online. The Affordable Connectivity Program is an amazing program, but most of the awareness of that program is for people who already have internet access, because that's how it's been promoted, right? Now, Jessica's going to spend a lot of money changing that, I hope. But we've got to get to those unconnected households. And then the other thing we have to do is we have to make it easy for them to participate. And that's partly make it easy for them to sign up for these programs, but the ISPs have some work to do here too. The ISPs have to make it much easier for people to sign up for their programs that they have to use the Affordable Connectivity Program. So it's about getting the policy right, focusing on the right people, and then making it easy for them to sign up and get connected.
Jean-Claude, just as I totally agree with what Evan just said, and Chairwoman Rosenworcel has a big role in this, but not the only role. What Evan just said about reaching out to and targeting the communities with very clear messages and easy to use, we're going to put a ton of resources into that because that's the ball game now. And you can help on that. You ought to think about that wherever you're based, because it's probably not you who needs to be connected or have devices. In fact, I feel confident saying that. But it's going to be a critical education awareness outreach effort for the next 2 to 3 years. And if we do that one well, then we're going to succeed.
Yeah, and by the way, all of you have products that are getting in front of the teachers and the families and the students that are going to need this. So anything you can do, because they're using your stuff in schools in many cases. So you need to leverage the platforms you have to get the word out and tell people about, hey, you can get connected at home. Here's how to do it as well. So there's a lot that this industry can do to sort of further these efforts.
Couldn't agree more, especially when you think about the fact that what you all are producing requires that foundation, access to powerful devices, access to broadband, sufficient access to broadband. So I have to go here because as an educator, this is where my heart is. So much has been written about interrupted learning during the pandemic. I'll give you some data here from the Brookings Institution. And it says that test score gaps between students in low poverty and high poverty elementary schools grew by approximately 20% in mathematics, 15% in reading, primarily in the 2021 school year, much more in that year than 19 to 20. So it got worse over time during the pandemic. The question, frankly, is thinking about this access to powerful technology, powerful devices, and again, sufficient access to broadband, how will those two combinations really help to begin to close and get us to a place perhaps we can begin to close this idea of the interrupted learning? John, I'll start with you as an educator.
Yeah, so the good news, I think, is to the extent that we can solve the digital divide issues, then the point that Chairwoman Rosenworcel made about the homework gap will be less of an issue, right? Kids will be able to do the same work, even low-income kids will be able to do the same work that more affluent kids have been able to do at home. But I think there's a secondary problem that goes to the design of tech tools, which is for many kids, the reason that they lost ground was not only that they were home doing virtual learning, so they were home alone doing virtual learning without support. And I think one of the reasons we see the growing divide is that for affluent kids, parents were sitting next to them. Maybe not in the same room. Maybe some of us in the room were doing this, right? Maybe you were somewhere working, but then when your kid had a question, a problem, they would come in the room, and ask for help. Well, for low-income families, they were much less likely to be able to stay home and support their kids' learning. And so to the extent that the tech tools only work if the kid has an adult helping guide them through it, that's not going to be enough. So I think one of the challenges for the sector is, how do we make it so that the tools that we've designed, let's say for the classroom with teacher support, now have a different version that kids can navigate more easily at home on their own? Unless we solve that, I don't know that we can get at some of the learning loss gaps that we've seen.
Any other takers?
I would just agree with what John said. I think that one of the things that's really interesting, and this again relates to many of the businesses you all are building, is the role of parents now has also changed in education in the last 2 years. And John's completely correct that affluent families have a completely different experience than low-income families on this, with an enormous impact on the educational outcomes for their children. The differences and the inequalities have been exacerbated in the last years. We should all be really deeply concerned about that. We have Ukraine, we have the climate crisis, but we still have an education crisis in this country for the bottom 40 or 50% of students. But I think what we've referred to it at Common Sense is a homeschool connection, because we have a really large consumer platform, 150 million users, but we have this education platform. And I think we increasingly see them cross-cutting. And that parents are, I think it's going to change the role of parents in education going forward. And I think the relationship between teachers and parents is going to change too, hopefully in a really positive way. I think, again, speaking to this audience in particular, that is going to be, if we really want to have the educational future that all children deserve, then looking at that homeschool connection is going to be critical.
So one thing that I would add, I think that, you know, the two of the silver linings of the pandemic are going to be this complete change in the political will around closing the digital divide, and the vast acceleration in the acceptance of technology in education. So my view is what has to, you know, so there were literally millions of teachers who were sort of hesitant about using technology prior to the pandemic, who now have experienced it. And someone told me a statistic the other day that 70% of teachers now feel comfortable using technology to try to differentiate learning. But I think what's going to happen next is there's going to have to be a great sorting, right? We tried everything in this country over the last 2 years about how to leverage technology for education. And now we need to go through a period of figuring out, okay, what really worked? And how do we make sure that those things rise to the top and get broadened and spread around the country?
You know, really well said. When you think about what happened the last couple of years, now school districts have learning management systems. Many did not have that before. But parents now have a view into the curriculum, their pedagogy, they never had before. We hope that never goes away, frankly. To your point, the question, how do you really leverage that? Chairman, I want to come back to you. You recently supported the concept of reinvesting auction revenue in public interest purposes, and you proposed modernizing the 911 system for public safety. Of course, is a compelling need, much as Congress has dedicated billions in auction money. Can you tell us more about this concept? What does it even mean to auction the airwaves?
Sure. Yeah, we're going into the weeds now, but let's see. Everyone here has a mobile device. You might have two. You can't imagine your life without them. And the truth is, more people feel that way than ever before. And as a result, we have to zone our skies to make sure all of your communications continue to function. And because we're doing more than ever before, our skies are getting crowded. So one of the things that we do at the Federal Communications Commission is we make policies to reallocate airwaves from one use to another. For instance, we had a lot of airwaves for over-the-air broadcasting years ago. Now we have less. We have more associated with 4G and 5G mobile services. And that repurposing is really complex legally, economically, when it comes to engineering. But one of the things that I have repeatedly suggested is that when Congress gives the FCC the ability to reallocate those airwaves and then auction them off for new commercial uses so everyone can have new gadgets and new connectivity, we raise billions of dollars. In other words, this invisible infrastructure is an incredible revenue raiser. So if we are going to raise revenue from our public airwaves, my idea is pretty simple. We have to put it to public purpose. We should take those billions of dollars and do things like set up a fund to close the homework gap, or, as I recently suggested, set up a fund to assist public safety. Our 911 systems in this country are in need of an upgrade, and if we set up such a fund, we'd be able to make sure that we're all safer when we make that call. So that's my most recent effort when it comes to airwaves, and I hope that's a reasonably non-technical explanation.
It's great. Grateful for your leadership, Chairman. Thank you. Evan, in November, you announced a partnership with the city of Oakland to really bring connectivity to apartment buildings, et cetera. What does that look like? How can that be replicated in cities across the country?
Yeah, so in our work to help close the digital divide, we realized that there just wasn't a lot of best practices out there in terms of like, what does this work look like on the ground? How do we get to those 18 million households that are not connected today? And so Mayor Libby Schaaf in Oakland is a huge proponent of closing the digital divide. And I had a conversation about, well, can we do a pilot of all the possible solutions that might actually work on the ground to get people connected. And there's two things we're focused on. The first thing is that we are deploying free Wi-Fi networks like are available in this hotel in low-income apartment buildings. Because it turns out that everyone who has a device, and I think you said earlier, 91% of school kids now have a device at home. Everyone who has a device knows that if they can see those 4 little bars and there's not a little lock next to it, they can just connect to it and get on the internet. And so we've done this in about a dozen buildings in Oakland now, and the results have been phenomenal. People simply, they find them and they get online. And it turns out that Wi-Fi is now good enough that all you have to do is run the access points down the hallways, and people can access it from within their apartments. You don't have to go into each unit anymore, and that cuts the cost by almost 75%. So we're doing that in a lot of buildings in Oakland. The second thing, though, we're doing is we're working with community-based organizations to do outreach to these families that are unconnected. It turns out one of the biggest problems is building trust around government programs. And so the people, you have to start with the people who already have trust. And so we're working with dozens of community-based organizations in Oakland to reach out to these folks and then help them enroll in the FCC's Affordable Connectivity Program. And what we're learning is that, in fact, these organizations do have the ability to build trust and to get people interested, and they can educate, but they really do struggle in assisting the families in getting signed up, both for the Affordable Connectivity Program and for the internet provider programs. And so what we're working on now with Oakland is how do we sort of overcome those barriers. And now we've taken the learnings that we've had so far from Oakland, and we've developed what we call our local leaders toolkit, and we're going to start rolling that out around the country.
It's fantastic. You know, this idea of local partnerships to national efforts, I think is critical. Let's end with a bit of dreaming. So regulations aside, market impacts aside, investments aside, how can technology revolutionize education, and what should be commonplace in the ed ecosystem that we don't currently have? Small question.
Well, look, we've talked about how urgent it is to close the equity gaps that we have. And to me, the real question for all of us is, can we leverage technology to get to a place where zip code and race and family income do not determine your educational destiny? And that, to me, is the measure of our success. And the honest truth is, 30 years plus into the ed tech sector, we haven't made enough progress on that equity vision. But I hope that everyone here is resolved that we're going to seize this moment, the closing of the digital divide, to ensure that the ed tech sector is leading us to a more equitable place.
Oh, it's hard to build on that. I just want to co-sign everything that John just said. But and also, I'm someone who deals with network technology. I don't deal with education. So this is a novice's point of view. But I get to spend a lot of time thinking about how we connect everyone in this country. Just adjacent to that is thinking about how we get people the devices they need to make that happen, in addition to the network infrastructure. But on the other side, I have this gut sense that we need to provide every educator in this country with a lot more support for this transition. This pandemic forced them to take a digital leap, and they performed incredibly. But I just wish deep in my bones that while I think about that network connection and that device, that we have another set of programs that help educators want to bring technology into their classrooms, incorporate into their teaching, and get them excited about the future of education.
So I just want to remind the audience what a historic factor it is that Jessica is the first woman chair of the FCC and the first mom chair of the FCC. This should not be lost on you. And Evan and John and I have worked with her for years. We are really proud that she has that historic role. So here's what I would say to you. The American dream has a basic tenet in it, which we all know, which is that we will leave a better future for our children. That is sort of fundamental to the basic imagination of America and the American dream. And I would tell you that is at risk right now in 3 separate ways, and that all of us are responsible for that. The first is because our democracy is at stake in an existential way that none of us would have thought possible 5 or 10 years ago. So I would say that is one existential challenge facing our country right now. The second I mentioned earlier is the climate crisis, because we are also facing a climate crisis that has an enormous implication for all of our kids going forward, us, but our children even more. But the third one is what we're talking about here today, which is the gross inequality that still exists in this country when it comes to children and education. And if we can use this moment, which is an extraordinary moment, to not just close the digital divide, but the educational divide, then that is the dream we should all have. And again, this is an ed tech conference. It's not a tech conference, it's an ed tech conference. So that is a mission all of us should own, and I challenge all of you to be part of the solution.
Follow that.
I think we should just leave it with that.
Join me in thanking this amazing panel. Thank you all.